Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this broadcast and to address what I consider really the most challenging problem in the world today, and that is the U.S.-China relationship. You know, during the every 4 years in the United States, we have a presidential election, and I think the Chinese would probably agree with me that there's a lot of criticism of China that goes on during those elections every 4 years. But I think others would agree with me that this is kind of different this time. There's a sort of added element of criticism of China that we really haven't seen before. And so I think the relationship is in crisis. And I would argue that we need to bring it back from crisis to a much more sort of orderly management of issues. Now, to be sure, this is it's a complex relationship. And so those who compare the current relationship with China to the past relationship with the Soviet Union, saying this is some kind of replay of the Cold War, I think it ignores some very fundamental aspects. First of all, in the United States, within the U.S. polity, within the U.S. political system, there's pretty much a consensus on the Soviet Union. Now, there are not too many people out there in the U.S. Somehow suggesting the Soviets had a point or we had to meet them halfway or something. There was a real consensus that the Soviet Union had subjugated through the Warsaw Pact mechanism a number of independent countries and essentially created what they hoped for, a kind of world domination, starting, frankly, in Europe. So I think the U.S. didn't require the kind of motivation to steel itself for a long-term endeavor against Russia. And the only questions were whether we should go after Russia even harder than we did. I think this China situation is much different. It's much different because unlike the U.S.-Soviet relationship, we have a tremendous interest in China's economy, and China has a tremendous interest in our economy. We have no interest in weakening the Chinese economy, nor do they have any interest in weakening the U.S. economy. But at the same time, we can see that the attitudes to China are getting worse by the day. There's, of course, the coronavirus issue, which I think when something affects the health of a public, they sort of want to look around and see what caused this. And then, of course, President Trump has essentially decided to run against China on the issue of his response to the coronavirus, to say, look, what could anybody do? The Chinese were dishonest and showed no transparency in terms of what this coronavirus was, and it created a circumstance that infected the rest of the world. And what's the rest of the world to do except to be very clear that this thing came from China? But again, I don't think that really captures the problem. I think it goes beyond that. And I think one of the fundamental issues is that China's rise coincided with the rise of automation in the manufacturing sector. And so lo and behold, I think what happened was you saw a lot of job loss among China's partners, especially the US or economic partners. And a lot of this job loss it was sort of felt by the general public that this is caused by China rather than automation. In fact, automation probably caused well over 50%, and some economists say over 60% of job loss has been caused by automation. But I think many people feel that China has caused this. So China has been kind of the symbol of these tough economic times, especially in the upper Midwest, where manufacturing jobs were lost at an alarming rate. And when you look at the American presidential election, it will be won or lost on the basis of the upper Midwest. So there's certainly that issue. So you combine this kind of economic competitor not playing fair with a sort of distant memory of what the Cold War looked like, and it doesn't look very positive right now. Certainly, the Trump administration has not used what I would consider all the diplomatic tools in the toolbox. Certainly, the president has his occasional meetings or telephone calls with Xi Jinping, but look at the relations with the foreign minister. Wang Yi and Mike Pompeo met in the fall of 2018, and incredibly enough, have not met even until this day. So that's a long time to go between meetings, the Chinese foreign minister and the US Secretary of State. And I think it speaks to a real deteriorating dialogue. In the meantime, China has embarked on projects that seem global in their reach. Certainly the Belt and Road Initiative is something that I think a lot of people are concerned about. Why is China investing so heavily in these places, in whether it's Southeast Asia or in Central Asia? And I think there's a lot of concern. What are China's aspirations here? So this all comes back really to the question of what can the U.S. do about it? What can it really do about China's effort to gain influence in Central Asia or Southeast Asia? What can it do about China's efforts to turn the South China Sea into a southern Chinese lake? And what can the U.S. do about China's efforts essentially to be very predatory in its economic policies that is pushing for forced transfers of technology and other issues? So I think it all adds up to a problem that we first need to understand does not have a military solution, but it does have a solution in the form of a U.S. being clear that we need to deal with this problem, but we also need to deal with this problem with sort of orderly thought and without the kind of rancor that we too often see. To me, a key aspect of this is, since there's so many economic issues with China, I think a key aspect of it is a capacity to work with other partners who have some of the same frustrations with China's very energetic economic policies that seem to be really efforts to thwart their partners. So I think we need to work very closely with the Europeans. And how are we doing on that? I don't think we're doing much at all. And I think we need a much more sort of cogent and unified basis for dealing with China. China is concerned about the decoupling, and you hear a lot about decoupling in the US, the idea that we don't want to be dependent on supply chains that reach into China. Well, I think we need to think that through a little. And I don't think anger and frustration with China is a good substitute for sound analysis. To be sure, there are some issues, whether it's in the response to the pandemic, personal protection equipment, these kinds of issues, where I think the U.S. will look to have shorter supply lines. But at the same time, I don't think it's in the U.S. interest to cut itself off from one of the great manufacturing centers of the world, and that is China. So I think we need to kind of look at how we can structure our bilateral trade with China. But again, these are issues that our European partners and other partners have similar problems with. So again, I think the effort should be a much more broad-based approach to make sure China understands that running trade surpluses of the order of magnitude that they've run with the U.S. simply not politically sustainable. It's not something they can expect to add ad infinitum. They need to understand that no country, not the U.S. and no other country, is going to accept these sort of longer-term imbalances. So this does speak to the need for much more robust dialogue with China. Now, I'm always in favor of dialogue, as I just suggested, but I don't think we should assume that dialogue can solve a problem in and of itself. We need to be very clear to China that with respect to, for example, the South China Sea, that maritime access, especially for maritime countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam, Indonesia, these are countries that really are countries that depend on their access to the seas, to free access to the seas. So for China to exert this kind of unilateral change in the status, to demand from other countries aircraft notification, these other issues that go beyond safety and rather go to the question of sovereignty, I think China needs to be careful not to be moving unilaterally. But I think we need to convey this in in a way that makes it clear that this is an essential interest of the U.S., essential interest in other countries, and work with those other countries to make sure that China understands that this is not just coming out of the U.S. and not just coming out of a U.S. election, but rather comes out of some really hard diplomatic work. So a lot of the efforts with China have to be efforts done with other countries to make sure we can understand what our range of interests are with places like the Philippines or Indonesia and others. So again, I think the U.S. has had a tendency to bilateralize too many of these issues, and has allowed its kind of diplomacy to atrophy in the last few years. I would suggest too that the U.S. Needs to understand that if you're going to be influential with other countries, you better be there. And diplomacy, I think, has a lot of it has to do with being there and being active and being engaged. And so when I see a diplomacy that is kind of left in limbo, where it's very clear that our focus is on our domestic issues and not on our diplomacy, we are weakening ourselves and really opening the door to more Chinese efforts to ingratiate themselves or through whatever means to create circumstances where we lose our leverage and lose our influence. And this, I think, goes to the heart of the matter. The current U.S. administration has taken the view that the U.S. is overextended, the U.S. is doing too much for too many other countries, the U.S. has not gotten enough in return, therefore the U.S. needs to kind of withdraw. And I think this effort to kind of reduce our profile, to withdraw, to claim that we've been victimized by our friends and allies, this effort is really opening the door to greater Chinese engagement the world over. So I think we need to be careful with the idea that somehow the world has treated us poorly and therefore we need to back off from these issues that require our attention. I think we need to be careful with that because we create a circumstance where people look around and don't see a U.S. Leadership, and people do look for leadership. The whole system has been, since World War II, has been premised on the idea that there is a kind of leadership out there. And so if we withdraw, what are we looking for? Are we expecting the Europeans to lead the world on these issues? I think Europe wants to do its part in the world, but wants to do its part along with the U.S. and not to be doing things in ways that are opposed to the U.S. Does the U.S. want to see global leadership handed over to international organizations? Remarkably enough, the U.S. has essentially has its own Cold War going with these international organizations, whether the World Health Organization or any number of the UN structures. So again, I think the U.S. needs to strengthen the relationships there. And I think if we can work on these partnerships, work on these regional alliances, work also on our global on our capacity to be a good global citizen. And I would suggest that whoever becomes president in November, I would suggest the first thing that person does on January 20th, 2021 is to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. You can argue all day whether that will solve all the environmental problems. I can tell you now it won't. But the idea of the U.S. withdrawing from something that has almost everyone in the world involved in it is a very bad idea. So I think if we can fix our diplomatic relationships, be engaged, strengthen international structures that were there to help us and help our allies, we'll be in a much better position to deal with a relationship that is with China that should not be allowed to fail. It is too big to fail, and we need to take it much more seriously. But to take China seriously, we need to take ourselves seriously and understand the importance that the U.S. has in the globe. Whether we like it or not, we need to be far more engaged. So thank you very much for this opportunity to address this extraordinary group of people. Thank you very much.